Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into what is literally the ultimate economic domino effect, the 1973 OPEC oil crisis.
Okay, let's just start right here with this number, 350%. I mean, just imagine waking up tomorrow and the cost of the gas you need to get to work or the fuel to heat your house has shot up by 350%, almost overnight. Well, that's exactly the jarring reality that hit consumers right in the wallet back in the early 1970s. But, how did we actually get there? What causes a resource that's as foundational as oil to suddenly become a weapon of global disruption? So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll hit the roots of the conflict, then the Yom Kippur War, how OPEC weaponizes oil, the global shortages and chaos, the auto industry shift, and finally, a new energy era. All right, Section 1, Roots of the Conflict, Geopolitical Tensions in the Middle East. To really wrap our heads around these economic shockwaves, we've got to first look at the territorial disputes in the Middle East, because economics and geopolitics, they are forever linked, and this is a textbook example. So back in early 1967, tensions were just incredibly high between Israel and its Arab neighbors. By June of that year, Israel launched a surprise attack on Egypt, igniting what became known as the Six-Day War. And the result of that was a dramatic shift in the map. Israel captured the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and then subsequently captured the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. This established Israel as a major military power in the region, and it also resulted in the displacement of thousands of Palestinians. Now, fast forward a bit, over 5 years later to October 1973, right during the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, an Arab coalition spearheaded by Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. Their main goal? To regain that territory lost back in '67 and force negotiations over Palestinian territories. Moving on to Section 2, the Yom Kippur War, which is really the trigger event here. This intense 3-week military conflict was the specific spark that would quickly ignite an absolute global economic firestorm. The fighting itself was fierce. There were heavy casualties on both sides, and it definitely caught Israel off guard initially. But here's where this local conflict turns into a global crisis. The war quickly pulled in the massive superpowers of the era, the United States and the Soviet Union. Crucially, the U.S. made the decision to step in and resupply the Israeli military. Now, Israel did eventually regroup, mounted a really strong defense, and emerged victorious. But that U.S. intervention, well, it directly prompted a massive retaliation from Arab nations. Section 3, OPEC weaponizes oil and the embargo begins. This is the moment the battlefield shifts from tanks and territory to, well, barrels and pipelines. So who exactly are we talking about here? OPEC. That stands for the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Back in 1973, this was a bloc of 12 member nations, places like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, who all cooperated to manage oil production and pricing. And here's an important detail. Even before the war broke out, OPEC was already getting really dissatisfied with the low prices Western oil companies were paying for their oil. Just look at the sheer scale of their market dominance. In the early 1970s, OPEC countries were pumping out roughly 55% of the entire world's oil supply. That is more than half. It really visually underscores the immense leverage they held. Think about it. If they decided to turn off the tap, the world's engine would literally just stall. And to gain leverage in post-war peace negotiations, and as a direct retaliation for that U.S. involvement we talked about, that is exactly what they decided to do. OPEC announced an oil embargo. But you have to understand, it wasn't just some blanket ban. It was a highly targeted economic weapon. They banned petroleum exports and cut oil production specifically aimed at the nations that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. So the primary targets here were the United States, Canada, Japan, the Netherlands, Portugal, and South Africa. That brings us to Section 4, Global Shortages and Chaos. This is the micro-macro impact. So these massive macro-level international policies instantly translated into micro-level, everyday chaos for regular citizens. Remember that 350% figure from the beginning? Well, this is what it looked like in raw dollars. The average retail price of a barrel of oil skyrocketed from about $3 to nearly $11. And that just injected massive instability into global markets. We're talking triggering excessive inflation, tanking productivity, and plunging economies straight into recession. The countermeasures that governments adopted really illustrate the sheer panic that's set in. Nations were scrambling to conserve whatever energy they could get their hands on. Over in the USA, President Nixon asked gas stations to voluntarily close up on Saturday nights and Sundays. States literally asked citizens not to put up Christmas lights to save power. No way, right? Some states even rolled out a 3-color flag system just to let drivers know if a gas station actually had fuel. In Japan, a country that relied on the Middle East for 90% of its oil, the government had to slash industrial and leisure auto usage by 20%. But get this, look at the Netherlands. They were actually handing out prison sentences for citizens who exceeded their electricity rations. The ripple effects all across Europe were just profound. Things like Sunday driving, flying, and even boating were flat out banned in countries like Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. Sweden actually had to ration gasoline and heating oil. And here is a pretty staggering geopolitical domino for you. The UK, even though they were somewhat insulated from the direct embargo, they were still thrown into a massive energy crisis. This whole situation really empowered coal miners and railroad workers to strike, and those strikes became a major factor in entirely defeating the British Conservative government in the 1974 elections. Think about that. An oil dispute halfway across the world literally toppled a government in London. All right, Section 5, the auto industry shift. We're changing the driveway. Let's zoom in on how this crisis forever changed the actual cars we see parked in our own driveways. Before 1973, American highways were totally dominated by these large, gas-guzzling vehicles. But when people suddenly had to spend hours just waiting in lines at gas stations, and by the way, the American Automobile Association reported that 20% of stations had absolutely zero fuel by early 1974, consumer demand just violently shifted overnight. All of a sudden, small, fuel-efficient Japanese imports like the Toyota Corolla and the Honda Civic completely exploded in popularity. American automakers were caught totally off guard. They were scrambling, rushing out compact models like the Ford Pinto and Chevy Vega, and eventually they had to shift their entire manufacturing philosophy towards smaller front-wheel drive cars. So the crucial takeaway here is that this was not just a temporary fad. The crisis forced a permanent, tangible improvement in vehicle efficiency. We can see the U.S. average fuel economy jumping from a pretty dismal 13.5 miles per gallon in 1970 to 17.4 miles per gallon by 1985. Basically, the crisis accelerated automotive engineering by a full decade. Which brings us to Section 6, a new energy era and permanent policy shifts. The extreme vulnerability that this embargo exposed forced governments to just completely rethink and restructure their entire approach to energy. They had to make absolutely sure they were never caught this defenseless again. So the United States fired off a barrage of policy changes. To force fuel conservation, they imposed a strict 55-mile-per-hour national speed limit. They even implemented year-round daylight savings time for a bit, just to cut down on evening electricity use. But most importantly, for long-term security, they created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in 1975 to stockpile emergency oil. Plus, they established an entirely new cabinet-level agency in 1977, the Department of Energy, to manage the nation's newfound focus on conservation and alternative energy. Japan did something similar. They diversified their economy, leaning heavily away from oil-intensive industries and steering right into the electronics boom that we know them for today. And that brings us to the end of our roadmap today, leaving us with a really critical question to chew on. We've just seen how a territorial dispute in 1967 escalated into a war in 1973, which triggered an embargo, which skyrocketed prices, caused global recessions, changed the very cars we drive, and entirely reorganized government infrastructures. I mean, it is the ultimate domino effect. So, as you look around today at the products you buy, the energy that powers your home, and this incredibly complex web of global trade, ask yourself, how vulnerable do our global supply chains remain right now to a single geopolitical spark? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.